Okay, welcome everybody to the Spring 2026 Lunch and Learn series. The intention of this series is to highlight the expertise of our faculty and alumni and to educate the broader community about pressing issues facing us today. So my name is Bo Holiday. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Criminal Justice, and I'll be moderating today's event. The event today is titled Police Body-Worn Cameras and AI, and will be led by Dr. John McCluskey, who I'm really excited to introduce. Just on a little bit of a personal note, he was the first police researcher whose name I was able to identify off of a reference list as an undergraduate at Washington State years ago. So today we all have the benefit of hearing from him. Dr. McCluskey is the Senior Executive Director at the School of Criminal Justice. His research is centered on two broad areas. The first involves body-worn cameras and their influence on policing and the criminal legal system. This includes research supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance that examines the application of artificial intelligence to body-worn camera footage, with the primary aim to examine the reliability of common tools to translate speech to text, diarization of speech, and object detection through computer vision. The second line of research that examines teacher maltreatment and victimization, supported by the National Institute of Justice. For nearly a decade, it uses longitudinal survey data to explore correlates and consequences of teacher victimization. These two strands of research are joined by the common theme of procedural justice as a framework for evaluating police performance and the influence of body-worn cameras, and for assessing how administrative responses to victimization reflect procedural justice principles. So before I turn things over to John, I'll review a few ground rules with the audience. I see just about everybody is muted. I'd ask that the audience would remain muted. John will field some questions after presenting. I'm going to read questions, so I'll ask that you submit the questions to the chat or send them to me in a private message, and I'll read them aloud once remarks are all finished up. Alternatively, once we open up for questions, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. We'll call on you, and you could ask John the question yourself. So with that, I'll go ahead and mute myself and pass this over to Dr. McCluskey.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. Thank you very much, Bo, for that fantastic introduction. It sounds a lot more impressive than it is. So thanks for fluffing it up. And also thank you to Dean Novkov and Renee and all the folks in Rockefeller College for having these lunch and learns. And I think the order of that lunch and learn is in the appropriate order for this talk. You should have a really good lunch and maybe there'll be a chance to learn something. I'm really glad that I called this a modest research agenda, because as I worked through it, I was fearful that I would have some tour de force of AI doing everything for us. And I actually kind of backed up, and with the help of some of my colleagues, let's see if I can go to the next slide here. Let's see. This is really an enormous research team that's worked on some of the problems that we're going to talk about today. And I hope you can leave here and think about artificial intelligence a little differently, maybe a little bit more confidently. But Adrian Martin and me and Saladin are at the Rochester Police Department and have been instrumental in helping us all understand the flow of body-worn camera footage. I've worked with them both for maybe 15 years with Adrian and 10 or more with Mian. There's a whole slew of Angela, Anita, Vivek, and Jonathan are students at the Rochester Institute of Technology with a completely different set of skills that have informed this research. And I highlighted Wyatt Otten and Hannah Desnick, two students here that probably did anything that you see that turns out well here. That's the responsibility of Wyatt and Hannah. I've screwed most things up. And also in green, I've got a class of students who are also working in this area. Angeliki, Antonio, Fantomata, Hippolyta, Itzel, Azaria, Karina, and Nyla have been working on this, and we've been talking about it for an entire semester. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Dr. Fouquet, who's kind of the champion of all this. So I'm standing on the shoulder of giants when I present this to you, and I hope I do this team proud. Let's see the next slide here. So I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for body cameras being adopted very quickly, so we get a sense of how technology sometimes is used to solve our problems, and then turn our attention to how AI might solve a problem created by the previous problem that we solved. So there's some names of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Walter Scott on the screen. And if you think back about a decade, these are African-American men who were killed in encounters with police officers in New York, Ferguson, Missouri, and in North Charleston, South Carolina. And they are sort of contemporaneous and maybe just predating the national adoption of body-worn cameras. And I think it's important to think about where were we at that point in time when we made this choice to move to body-worn camera footage. And so along the same line, in terms of thinking about accountability, we have a report that comes out from the Obama administration, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And in that report, there is this action item. Law enforcement agencies should review and consider the Bureau of Justice Assistance BJA body-worn camera toolkit to assist in implementing body-worn cameras. And BJA also got an immense amount of funding to ensure that police departments would consider adopting body-worn cameras. The Rochester Police Department, which is our research site for today, is one of those police departments that was an early funded grantee for body-worn cameras. And that is the kind of set of circumstances that led us to where we are now 10 years later. And I want to just kind of trace that out. These are all efforts at some accountability, and they rely on some theoretical foundations that have some pretty strong assumptions about what body camera footage might do for us. The two big ones here for us today are accountability and what would that look like. So when police, we can think of organizations having accountability. So the organization's adopting and deploying body cameras, but also the fact that individual officers are accountable for their time spent with civilians in police-citizen encounters. And the belief is that if we have it on video, then officers can be held accountable. And that rests on a bunch of assumptions, right? That the video will be watched by somebody, that a complaint by a citizen, for example, might provoke someone to watch it, or a use of force report might provoke someone to watch it. And that kind of review is in the background of this 2015 to even current times adoption of body-worn cameras. And then there's another leg of theory here that is the civilizing effect, the belief that there would be a deterrent effect on officer misbehavior, perhaps because they're on camera. However, they're wearing the camera, so they're not really on the camera. And maybe also citizens would behave better. If some of you have been involved in police research, you know that difficult encounters with citizens often involve people that are under the influence of very strong emotions, alcohol or other drugs, perhaps the effects of some mental illness, and those kinds of encounters that police have might not really have the video or the possession of a body camera might not have any effect at all on those kind of more difficult encounters. So we had a vague theory that came with the 21st Century Report and early research on body-worn cameras, but the assumptions that that theory lies on top of might be a little bit shaky. So nevertheless, we pressed on and adopted body cameras. And here we are looking at kind of how body camera footage flows just for everyone's edification. So somewhere over on the left-hand side of the screen, we have incident. That would be a police-citizen encounter. There's an expectation that officers would activate it. And you're right to say, well, what if they don't activate it? If they don't, then we don't have the video, right? After that, we have to categorize and store the video. And that is going to be the actual punchline of most of our conversation today. What amount of video actually gets categorized and stored? And then some of the video is used internally, and that could be for complaints and arrests. And some of it eventually makes it out to the public. In the case of RPD, it gets released as a YouTube video, but video is also available for district attorneys, defense. One thing that I think Wyatt, Hannah, and I discovered is insurance companies also like video as well. When there's a car accident, then there's often an opportunity for some video to be provided to insurance providers. And that's why we actually had access to some of those. So that's kind of every police department is engaging in some kind of data flow that looks a little bit like this. And this is the learning part of our show. None of you, I hope, have seen Homer Simpson winning an Oscar. But he's an important part of this slide. This is Rochester Police Department's monthly hours of video that they're collecting and ingesting since they adopted their program. They actually adopted it in 2016, but was started with 2017. They actually offloaded their program at the end of this series to a cloud-based provider. And this was all kept on premises at the Rochester Police Department. And what you can see is this is about 2,500 hours to 3,000 hours a month that's being collected from police officers. To tell you a little bit about Rochester, Rochester has about 600 officers, or 600 sworn, and about 400 patrol officers. They police the city. It's got a population of about 200,000 people. And in New York, Rochester has, since 2020, which is that spike up here, has experienced post-COVID a pretty severe uptick in gun violence that's been declining since about 2021 or 2022 at a peak. But it's been an outlier, I think, in the state of New York in terms of that. So that's the setting from which we're gathering data. We're really interested in the police-citizen encounters, not so much violence, but and so why is Homer Simpson there with an Oscar? Well, the Homer Simpson, the Simpson TV show, plus all the Oscar-winning movies since 1927 through 2020 is 500 hours of footage. So every month, the Rochester Police Department is accruing 6 times that body. Right? The Simpsons, I think, are the longest running TV show. And the Oscar movies are usually about 2 hours long. So this is an amazing amount of footage, and it creates a problem of too much information. All right, so TMI. We're left with a problem here today of how can we make sense of those data and how much could possibly be reviewed. And another question we would have is how much data is actually ever examined? And I would say that there is a system whereby some number of videos that is very small are randomly reviewed by supervisors, but it's lost in the decimal places in terms of the amount that is actually being reviewed. And it also is clear that in a study of 7 sites the Bureau of Justice Assistance did, one site was able to track how often videos were opened and actually reviewed by somebody after the encounter. And it turned out that about 1 in 20 videos actually gets reviewed by someone. So most of it just stays in that first kind of tub of categorized and stored. And one of the problems with that is the storage costs money. And after a while, under certain categories that are kind of innocuous and mundane, don't involve a complaint, don't involve an arrest, don't involve taking a crime report, that video has to be purged to make room for the next month's video, or, well, usually it's 180 days before it actually gets purged, so 3 months video. So that is being discarded without ever being watched. That brings us to the last point of thinking about new ways of reviewing footage and auditing data, and the kind of AI part of our show today. All right, so this looks really complex, so I put a bunch of numbers on it, and I'd focus you on the number 1. Multimodal models, if you see that somewhere, really means something about the idea of something where an audio channel is coming out of the body-worn camera footage and a video channel is coming out, and those are the 2 modes, multimodal. Sounds a lot more impressive than it is. We're going to ignore object detection and image or computer vision and all that for now, and reserve that for maybe the conversation afterwards. And we're going to focus on this first part here. The first step would be actually transcribing what was said in an audio stream of a police officer encountering a citizen. Another important part of this that we're not going to discuss very much about is speaker diarization. So we could have a translation of what was said. We also have to assign it to the right person. So if I'm speaking with Bo and the algorithm assigns Bo's speech to me, that's a problem, right? But we're not even going to get to that point. The last step in this, which I think I probably promised, is this idea of number 3 down here, natural language processing. Once we have an accurate transcription and appropriate diarization, we might be able to make some inference about what the police officers and the citizens were doing and how well they were doing. We might be able to do that. And that is sort of this bailiwick of artificial intelligence as applied to the body-worn camera footage. I actually want to go backwards a step in artificial intelligence and just talk about LLMs, because they actually are the basis for automatic or automated speech recognition. And this is from a website called Tick Tokenizer, and you've heard of tokens before. And tokens are these little phonemes of our language, right? So this is an example that I put into this Tick Tokenizer looking at GPT-4o. And this is Aurora Police's unprofessional drop when AI reviewed body cams. And basically, LLMs are a integer basis distillation of our language, right? Those books and websites and Reddit posts and tweets that we have are turned into numerical symbols for computers, because computers can then calculate the relationship between words. And GPT, generative pre-trained transformers, can then produce something that looks like what we speak. And so a computer is turning this 1, 2, and 3 here. This un is 537, 2 is 104393 in its lexicon, and 3 is 2367. Police actually appears as 2 different kinds of words inside of this particular LLM. And the idea here is that these tokens are a compressed version of sort of human knowledge. And those are the basis from which audio is actually turning into words. They're getting passed through an algorithm that is LLM in basis. So this is the audio from a body camera, in theory, coming through. And the artificial intelligence has to cut that into small segments, say 15 milliseconds, which is a bit, stitch those apart and think about what part of language is this 15 millisecond element, and then recompile it into the words that were likely spoken by that person. And you can think of this as a little feedback here, because as we speak, we give context. So if you're ever typing and you get an autocomplete, well, there's only a few things that you can type after mother-in-law. And I won't say what they are. I like my mother-in-law. So the most likely word to come next is part probability and part a analysis of the waveform that are coming through the computer, which are actually a bunch of numbers. They're not the actual sounds. But you want to kind of think about that. This is what's going on under the hood of artificial intelligence. So if you've ever worked a little bit with AI, then you know that there are some problems that come up. They include hallucinations. That's very common in text, where it will give you sites that don't exist or legal cases that don't exist. There's also, in the speech world, a failure to translate. That is, it could completely miss words, and then it could also mistranslate. And those are things that I do as well. Well, I don't hallucinate very often, but I certainly mistranslate, and we all do that. But from this, Wyatt, Hannah, the team at RIT, developed this idea to have a human review of transcripts and try to identify the places where these kinds of errors accrue. And you could say to me, well, why would you bother with this, John? This does not seem like a very useful project. I'm starting to think I might agree with you, but I don't. There's at least 2 vendors that are selling this right now to police agencies. And I don't want to name them because I don't really know what their algorithm is. And the more we do this, the more we think, well, they might be onto something. But vendor 1 is looking only at the audio channel and claiming they can classify police-citizen encounters as high, standard, and substandard, using natural language processing, going through that step of automatic speech recognition, diarization, and then looking for discourteous language and other behavior-based, linguistically behavior-based kind of artifacts that would correlate with substandard police behavior. Vendor 2 claims to have a multimodal assessment. That suggests to me computer vision. I don't know much about that. And they actually have a couple of outputs that say we can identify calm, respect, the tone of an encounter, clarity, rapport built by police officers. Again, it's going to be based on those things that I just told you about, a large language model and some model that is taking waveform sounds that are captured digitally and turning that into words. Words assigned to me, words that might be assigned to Bo, and then trying to figure out, did John and Bo treat each other well? Did John and Bo have disrespect? As I said, I just want to drive this home. We're only going to focus on automatic speech recognition because it is the first leg of the stool for actually getting to the point where I was acting professionally or I was actually acting unprofessionally. So if we want to think about this project, it's kind of a classic UAlbany project. It's a search for the sources and structure of error in automatic speech recognition. And we anticipate that there are diarization errors as well. That is, that people are misassigned the text that they may not have spoken. And if you've ever looked at your transcripts on Zoom, you'll see this once in a while, that Zoom will inadvertently assign somebody the wrong statement. And then the last, natural language processing and actually assigning a label of professionalism, that also must have some error structure, but we're not going to focus on that right now. Simply put, I think we are going to work on the verification of automatic speech recognition as the first point of actually getting to some kind of output. But I would warn you that we'd suspect that this probably has like a compounding effect. If I don't have the right translation and I don't have good diarization and I have a poor measure of professionalism, right, we're multiplying errors across that. And very quickly, you can see that your final output could be quite poor, but we'll just stick with one kind of poor output. Okay, so here's our show for today. This is what you've all come here for. I hope your lunch is really good. We've got 10 videos that we've gotten from RPD. We actually have several hundred publicly released videos, but it accounts for about an hour of audio. And we assessed these 3 items below. Hashtag H, hashtag E, hashtag missing. So hallucinations, errors, and missing. And those are in the automatic speech recognition world considered insertions. That's hallucination. A substitution is an error, and a deletion is missing. That is their lexicon for understanding that. And that's what we've done with 10 videos is to code them once and then have a gold standard coder go through and correct them. And this is a pretty tedious process because the starting video that we had, or the starting transcript that we had in some cases was quite poor. And what we were able to do with a gold standard transcript was run it against 3 kinds of automatic speech recognition that are generally available to the public. And I'll over at the one on your screen, AWS is Amazon Web Services, Microsoft is number 2, and Whisper is an open source model that also does automatic speech recognition. You'll see that we got down to the N of 8, and I'll explain why in the next slide. But we have about 4,200 reference words that are actually spoken across this hour that we're able to examine. And I'd bring you quickly to number 2, and you can see that Whisper has 826 substitutions, right? And that's an error. And it also has 162 insertions, and those are hallucinations. If we go all the way over to the right panel, it looks like Amazon Web Services gives you about 25% error, so 75% accuracy if you want to frame it in that direction. Microsoft has, now I'm going to do math on Zoom, it's not going to work out, about 78% accuracy, and it looks like Whisper has about 58% accuracy. One of the things that would be true about our research project is we started with Whisper because we had some other interests in mind, and we didn't realize how useful Amazon Web Services and Microsoft are. These are completely untuned. This is what you can buy for 2.5 cents per minute. to translate your audio. And it does a fair job. In fact, the contracts from at least one of the vendors suggest that their benchmark is about 70% word accuracy. And so Amazon and Microsoft seem to be able to reach this without any kind of training. There's another thing that we could do, which would be to give a corpus of police citizen trained audio to our model to train it for what police officers and citizens are likely to say, and also increase the lexicon. So the jargon that police officers might use is something that also could give these models a fit. On to the next thing. This is kind of humorous, but you can see here, this is word error rate again. And now the blue bar is all 10 cases that we had, and the orange bar is the trimmed model that only had 8. And Microsoft really got penalized heavily because it is very polite. One of the videos that we had that we excluded was very noisy, and another video, it featured a lot of swearing. And Microsoft does not translate swear words into the actual words. It will replace it with sort of a bunch of asterisks. We can correct for that, but we had to get this show on the road for today, so we did not. And we're planning on doing this for about 10 hours of video by the end of the summer. And we will sample a little more carefully from the body of released footage that the Rochester Police Department has. But we are interested in being able to describe errors and to try to figure out the conditions under which errors propagate. So this could be helpful for AI applications to body-worn camera footage. So that leads me to this last slide, and it looks like we're almost on target here. The first thing that we really want to do is complete our project and have 10 hours of footage. But once we do that, we can start to inject noise into the videos and do this over, because we believe that noise, it has to degrade the ASR performance. But we also think that the noisiest cases are the most interesting cases. When Bo and I are yelling at each other, that might be something that you want to watch, but it might be really hard for ASR to pick that up. It'll be really hard for ASR to deal with crosstalk. So if there are 2 officers and 2 citizens, and there's a lot of people talking, also your radio can be going off. That can be a real degrader for the ability of ASR to work. But we want to document that and say, under these conditions of noise, this is what the type of ASR fidelity will be delivered to a user with a common model. Again, we can't tell much about what those vendors are doing, but we suspect it can't be vastly different from what Amazon and Microsoft are doing. The other part of this would be to get to the other end of natural language processing, that second point of looking at uncorrected transcripts versus corrected transcripts. Do you actually get a different sort of evaluation of standard, substandard, or professional behavior that is being emitted by police officers? At the beginning of this, we would have thought yes, but the more we've done it, the more we think the errors might not be so important, but that's a question that we want to actually answer, not just a hypothesis to pose. Speaker diarization, we don't know anything about that. We've spoken to people in the legal area, so downstream law, district attorneys and defense attorneys get this footage, and it's way too much for them to review. And so they often rely on a company that will have AI produce transcripts of the BWC. So doing very much what we're doing here further down the line with a separate set of video that's for a different purpose. But diarization seems to be very difficult and hard to crack. And actually 2 of the team, I think Vivek and and certainly Jonathan are both working on that. And I hope it is something that is cracked. And last point is, if you're a police manager and you have somebody come around and tell you that artificial intelligence can solve a problem of accountability of officers, that's very persuasive. But if you could back up and see how artificial intelligence is working, I think we could arm people that are purchasing agents, technology officers, and police chiefs with the ability to ask some hard questions of vendors and say, under what conditions does ASR actually work? And 2 real quick points. One could be, we should maybe just scan the corpus of audio for noise. And you should have supervisors, when possible, reviewing very noisy video. And the other is computer vision has been like scene based. Can we actually tell how scenes change? And I think Anita or Angela has been just studying how pixels move around the screen. And it certainly seems like when there's very rapid movement, she can tell when someone is fleeing from the police and the police are involved in a chase versus a comparison non-chase scene. So there might be shortcuts to uncovering videos that human beings should be watching. So I would say as full confessional here, Wyatt, Hannah, the RIT team, we've used AI tools to develop Python codes, to make some of the diagrams that you've seen in this presentation, and just to assist in being able to be better social scientists and better computer scientists. So I don't think we're pessimists about AI, but I think we're sort of just want to peer under the hood and see what we can learn, like a good social scientist, which I'm not, but the others are. I think that's it. Let's see, how do I stop myself here? Escape, maybe. Do that. There we go. Oh, I'm still sharing my screen, huh? Let's see.
Okay, so right now I just invite anybody to put a question that they have into the chat. I have a few questions, and we also had a few come in with the registration link, but just while people are typing their questions in, I've one for you, John, is what exactly, or just like painting with a broad brush, what are you seeing it mess up on, like the errors and the substitutions?
I think it depends on the model. So the Whisper, the free model, has a corpus that is lots of different languages, and there's ways to tune the automatic speech recognition. And if you do not, you can wind up with things like emojis or Cyrillic characters in the output. So you want to learn how to tune them. I think Amazon Web Services is the best. Error does seem to come when a video is noisy, but that's kind of an impressionistic view. We don't have an actual metric by which we can say that, and hence the desire to inject noise. And noise, actually, we've learned this. Noise has different components. So there's white noise, pink noise, blue noise. Who knew? And some of those represent kind of background talking. Others represent sort of wind noise that you might get. The crosstalk from radios is really deadly for interpretation. So the other thing about police videos is there's speech that occurs that's not actually present, right? So the radio could be making noise, and the audio from the audio receiver in your body-worn camera would be picking that up. So I guess the short answer is I think noise is the major concern, broadly defined.
But okay, we just had a question here come in from the chat. How long before AI could help us get reliable screening of body-worn camera footage to identify inappropriate policing behavior? Basically asking for a timeline here.
Yeah, I would say a year ago, I would say it'll be a decade off. I would say now that we've started using Amazon and think about how you pipeline this together, right now, none of that video is being watched at all. So I think this is going to be a good enough answer, which is when will it be good enough that we say we could identify, at least in that unwatched video, half of the videos that really need to be reviewed by a supervisor. I think that's probably in the next year or two. And the reason I've come to this conclusion is because I started looking at sort of Moore's law and computational advances and how AI is advancing. And I don't think where we are now, if it doubles again in a year, it won't be easy for me to understand where that will be, because AI has come so far just from, I think 2017, Ilya Sutskever published an article about attention, and that got this LLM thing going. Pretty soon thereafter, Microsoft developed automatic speech recognition that was as good as human transcribers who are transcribing speech. The problem we have is the conditions under which police work are not quiet. They're not obvious. My audio channel is coming through something called John McCluskey. So Zoom knows to put my audio under my name. It's easy to diarize me and Bo, but it's very hard to diarize the officer. There's some talk of voice print being possible. To be honest, I've experimented that in reverse with my class. And I had something called 11 Labs clone my voice and make a short piece of a lecture for them built out of something developed by AI that read one of my papers. And that's the scary future. That's not exactly the same as translation though. GPT is producing things, right? So it could produce words that it might think I would say based on research I've done, and then put my voice over that. But actually verifying what I've said or what Bo said or what a police officer said is a little harder, and that verification is the trick. So short answer, 2 years, I think, I think part of this conversation would be having the public involved in being able to contribute to that last segment of natural language processing. Like, what does good policing look like? So AI might get there, but the public conversation about what should be flagged as good policing or substandard policing, I think is really going to still rely on human beings. And there's another forum where BJA convenes folks with justice and security strategies, and a police chief in Illinois suggested that sometimes officers swear just so that they can build rapport with citizens, right? So the AI could flag that, but it will take a supervisor to say, I see what you did there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is kind of related to issues with picking up speech and diarization possibly. But given that the camera is located close to the officer, is there a concern that it's more likely to pick up clear audio from that officer than from others involved in the incident? And might that introduce some kind of structural concern?
That is a concern for the collection of evidence, maybe, of what happened at a scene. Most of the work on police accountability is focused on what police officers say and how they say it to citizens. So that's actually a good feature because we have the clearest audio from the officer. If you're interested in whether the officer was listening to the citizen and acting upon requests by the citizen as part of good police work, that might be less reliability there. So that indeed is a problem and part of the error structure that you would have to deal with when you think about police accountability. It might be that we have to land on some very basic police manners in their communication with citizens as the accountability that you can get out of a body-worn camera. So I think that's kind of the answer there.
So let's see what other questions have come in here. Footnote, body-worn camera footage also protects officers doing their job properly. It's true. We have a question here about the retention period. Where do you see the retention period and privacy interests implication versus the benefit of complete retention of body-worn camera footage for possible future need?
Well, if you've got 3,000 hours a month coming in, you're talking about quickly adding up petabytes of footage, and that is why there's this automatic deletion process. I think permanent retention would rely on a kind of computer memory that we just don't have. We don't have that capacity. So this AI is tuned to, or this, if AI can actually work to do this, it's tuned to say, maybe there are some that we should retain for a longer period if it comes to the point where it is identified as having some sort of questionable professionalism. That is, we would delete the ones that don't pass through the AI, that can pass through the AI without any kind of question, because we just need the space for the next month's video. But we might be able to archive some proportion. And I would not want to hazard a guess on the trade-offs that are being made there, but you might be able to archive video that should be watched by a human being, and or if we think about this in terms of archaeology, where sometimes they don't do something for 100 years hoping that there'll be a better technique. we might imagine that AI could get better at this and should get better at this. And 2 years from now, maybe we can look at that video. But I think that the storage costs are just too expensive. In fact, the cutoff at RPD was they realized that storing things on premise probably didn't make as much sense as putting them in the cloud with a provider and not having to take care of that. Because so it does have evidentiary value. It also has to have backups. So you're not just saving it once, you're saving it twice so that it's secure. The city of Rochester had it inside the police department and also saved somewhere else in case of a fire or some other natural disaster. So that kind of system gets expensive very quickly.
Good. We had another question come in on the registration form. So if not already covered in a presentation, please share information about how digital tools might be periodically audited to rule out that ASR and NLP have not been hacked or otherwise compromised or potentially biased. Perhaps the intention is that both sides of any case would be permitted to further evaluate the content if they disagree with the initial AI interpretation.
So in the case of I'm trying to think of where this would land in that system. I'm thinking hacking could be a problem anytime something's stored in the cloud, and you wonder how often that has already happened. So the provenance of the video is important, right, as evidence, and the systems are tuned to ensure that access is controlled and monitored, so we know who watched a video, and you have to have permissions to watch a video. That's one way. The hacking of the ASR and the NLP, that's a really good question. And my thought would be twofold on that. One is that the police department might have a series of known videos where they say, here's 100 videos, and we know 1/3 of them are super professional, 1/3 of them are standard professional, 1/3 of them are unprofessional. Let's run them through every month and see how it gets classified, just as a validation that our algorithm is working the way it's always worked, because it's quite possible, as the questioners noted, these things get updated and something might be introduced that reduces the fidelity of the system. So you probably would want to do that. Hacking, I'm not so sure about, but the other part of the NLP that I think would be important, that whole block is a series of value choices that you make about what do we want from officers and what can we reasonably get from the video. And I think that's a great place for police agencies to have conversations with citizens. Right now, we see a lot of what looks like malpractice sometimes from police agencies, because that's what they have to release. The Los Angeles Police Department has many videos of police officers involved in shootings with citizens, and some of them look justifiable, some of them much less so. And it might be good for them to have, it might be helpful for the agency and the public to know that 98% of encounters with the public are actually relatively mundane and positive, or at least professional in terms of the officer's demeanor. And that's defined by X, Y, and Z. But right now, I think it's hard for the public to imagine that, because most of what we see are the 150 or 200 videos that the LAPD puts together of critical incidents, they call them, mostly use of force, use of deadly force, and police shootings. So that might help the community that is really interested in police accountability having some say in what do we want to hold the police accountable for. That was kind of a filibuster answer.
Let's see here. We just had another question pop in. I live in a very diverse area. Are there any concerns about quality stemming from individuals with heavy accents? Would they be unintentionally screened and then underrepresented in videos flagged for screening because they couldn't be transcribed?
That is a fantastic observation, question, and yes is the answer. The ability to pick up a phoneme that we deliver is going to depend on those accents. Different languages are not going to be picked up very well, right? That's a possibility. The other thing that Wyatt and our research team has speculated on is the pitch of your voice probably contributes to the data stream that goes through ASR, and that might actually influence the fidelity of ASR in translating what you say. And pitch is obviously related to gender, and we suspect that there may be some systematic error there that accrues. So certainly, ASR functions differentially based on accent, and trying to tune to, say, a Southern accent would, I think, requires a heavy lift. Fortunately, I think in Rochester, the most accent they have is they call soda pop. Great question.
I'm going to ask another question that I have myself. And we're living in the world of self-driving taxis now, right? And I know you just covered the audio transcriptions, and you covered that it's a lot more complex than other contexts that we're trying to transcribe audio. Is the police-citizen interaction the same type of thing? It's not as controlled or typical as a roadway would be. There's more randomness in a police-citizen interaction, or do you want to just speak to where AI is at with that, interpreting events and video?
Well, in the do you eat your own cooking, my wife and I took a Waymo in San Francisco a few years ago. And I was really disappointed to learn that it's possible that someone in a distant land was actually giving the Waymo commands if it got stuck in a tough spot. So I'm not so sure that we've reached all the promise. Um, the so I think perfection is the enemy of the good here. So if we could get an accurate transcript of what you and I said, at least on one-on-one encounters, we could know something about kind of maybe my language use with citizens under certain conditions. And that could be that we could identify trainable moments. We could identify moments where I actually need some sort of remedial help or punishment. But I think they are more complex, and that's why a human being is ultimately going to have to watch these for a long time. None of these providers, I think, are going to say we ought to punish somebody based on the video and audio stream that we see, only that these should be reviewed. And ultimately, a human has to review this. Right now, with the 3,000 hours, we don't know which ones we should be looking at. But if we could turn it into 50 hours that we have to review every month, well, that's 2 hours a day. And if you split that amongst all the supervisors, maybe they could think about doing that. But right now, they don't know which videos to be looking at, otherwise, unless they come with a use of force complaint, right? Or a complaint or a use of force report, in which case a supervisor is likely watching the video and trying to make sense of what occurred. But otherwise, my guess is that they're not being watched. So back to the question. It's really hard to tell what we ought to define as good police work, but we could start with some common, like, let's flag this video and watch it. And if you have something like a police accountability board, maybe that could be something where they watch them in conjunction with police command staff and try to think about how things could be done differently, or why sometimes you have to accept something that's lawful but awful looking.
Another question just came into the chat. A recent study of the use of a vendor's product that algorithmically generates measures of professionalism reported anecdotally that officers learned how to game the metrics. If, as one of my students observed, what matters is what we measure, might officers' adaptations be detrimental or beneficial to the quality of policing?
Well, yeah, it depends on what those measures are, right? If you define professionalism as something that the community and command staff agree is professional policing, whatever that may be, maybe it's procedural justice, really good at de-escalating and calming situations down, and you feel that you can rigorously measure it, then that would be a good thing. If, on the other hand, I sold you a product and I was able to classify things into 3 buckets. And one of them was this unprofessional bucket, and you knew very quickly that what was being tagged, and they don't really have a great map onto professional behavior, um, then that would be detrimental to good police work, because you could continue doing whatever it is that might be unprofessional but unmeasured, and merely have to pay lip service to whatever the algorithm is screening you for. And I mean, I suspect that's how I wound up being senior executive director. I don't know what I'm doing.
Okay, here's a question that came in before in the registration. Are body-worn cameras having the intended effect on policing that they're meant to have? Has it been worth the efforts in policy, retention, and review, etc.? What is the effect, if any? And has there been any mimetic isomorphism that has occurred even in some departments?
That sounds like four questions. Um, no, yes, maybe, I'm not sure. So I think I don't think that the promise of body-worn cameras has paid off. Given, I would think there are a couple of measures that we would say, have they paid off? One might be the police public contact survey. Like nationally, we've invested in this. Do we see some change in the positive regard that citizens have, or public opinion perhaps has changed towards police because they've maybe changed behavior? And the last measure we might have nationally is the fatal encounters, for example, between police officers and citizens, which seem to have been, they're pretty stable on an annual basis. Those have not improved substantially, but they're also outliers, considering there's about 50 million encounters a year. But still, there are a fair number of these. So if I looked at those as indicators of something changing, I'm not sure that I would say, I wouldn't be very confident to say policing change. But there's also a really lousy map from body-worn camera adoption to those kinds of outcomes, because there's been sort of sporadic adoption of body camera technology that was funded by BJA, and now they're actually funding more small rural and tribal police departments, and those are much more numerous. And we think there might be like a higher likelihood of fatal encounters in those rural departments. And that might suggest that actually body cameras do have some impact if we saw those kinds of fatal encounters get reduced. But overall, I would say, given the amount of money that's been spent, I'm not sure. However, given that AI is here and what it might be able to do, I think, again, in 2 years, we might be able to say, yes, body-worn cameras coupled with this technology has a value added for organizations. First, it would add to the ability to identify the pathways by which police officers de-escalate, and you might be able to identify the best performers in that metric and use them as trainers, or use their materials as a basis by which to train officers or create virtual reality simulations. That's something we haven't had in the past. We've had virtual, or we've had kind of scenario-based training, but now we can actually observe what transpires in police-citizen encounters and maybe learn from those in a way that we couldn't in the past. I think there are some police departments, I have a sense, that are vaguely engaging in this and trying to build a corpus of training video that will help them identify a superior pathway to an encounter with a citizen, and maybe an inferior pathway where you might wind up in a bad place if you start here. So that would be my guess, that could be where the promise of body-worn camera footage will lie in the future. But right now, I would say the early adoption of it, if you looked at that spike in the Rochester Police Department in September 2020, had about 6,000 hours of footage. That was the Rochester Police Department responding to civil disturbances that were rooted in Daniel Prude's death earlier in April, and the kind of very slow uncovering of it by the police department and the mayor's office. And you could see that in Los Angeles as well, right? You could see some body cameras were on people and it didn't really affect what got delivered to the public. So I think, I don't know if I answered every part of that question, but I tried.
I think you did. We just had one final question come into the chat. We have about 5 minutes left, and then we'll make sure this ends by 1 o'clock. But this last question says, this is a little bit novel, but there's a plethora of body-worn camera footage on YouTube used as reaction videos. Could this be garnered? Could they be garnered for review? Some professionals do this.
So I'm not clear if that is, would police departments use them for instruction, or would social scientists use them for data? I'm going to answer it like it's the latter. So yes, there are lots of YouTube videos of police citizen encounters. The one thing that I would be concerned about is there often edits to those. So if you're doing a computer vision, you're going to have washed out areas where there's any personal identifying information, identity. You're also going to have audio drop out because people's names or juveniles' names will be dropped out of audio, and they are curated and redacted in some ways. So they're imperfect records for some of that work. And we suffer some of those problems as well, and choose not to look at some videos that get blurred out because they become totally blurred out because of who's involved. Juveniles, for example, there could be foils that involve juveniles, but most of the frames will not be viewable. So I'm not sure if I answered that question or not with that. YouTube review. Okay. Yeah. I guess I would back up and even say we have looked at Los Angeles Police Department and other agencies releasing snippets of BWC as parts of a larger account of a critical incident. So use of force, and use of force videos that are coming out of LAPD. Usually they're about 20 minutes long, and that usually features a long intro by somebody who used to be the weather man in LA early on, and then about 2 minutes of video, and then an outro that features sort of, this is what happened. Perhaps the person is deceased, or maybe they've been arrested after the encounter, and maybe their prior record is displayed as well. So there are, I think, the presentation of video from police agencies might be something to be cautious of or aware of and account for when you're doing that kind of work, that they have a vested interest in putting themselves in a particular light. And LA is actually a very interesting city to study because they've had several encounters where they've inadvertently shot a civilian who was not involved. I think one happened in a Trader Joe's, and another happened in an department store where someone was in a dressing room, and the police fired at a suspect and shot through a wall and killed a woman who was in the dressing room. And I guess, those get presented in a particular way to the public.
Okay, well, I have 1 minute here, so if there's any closing remarks that you want to make, John, I'm not sure how I end this whole thing,
Okay.
but I think we're about our time.
I'd love to end it. I would say I think I'm kind of an optimistic person, and I'm an AI semi-optimist. I've learned a lot by looking at Feifei Li and Andrew Karpathy, and they both have really fantastic YouTube trainings on. Feifei Li is about computer vision. Karpathy is about LLMs generally. They both were founders of some pretty important companies, and they seem to do this out of the goodwill that they have of trying to engage the public and try to have us learn about what's going on behind the scenes. So we're not just using the word AI, but we're thinking, okay, an LLM is doing this, it's advancing, and the more information that goes into these, and the more curation and training and honing goes in, and high-speed compute that's available, the different kinds of products that we'll get out of them. And I'd also encourage not using the basic version of these things because they're not very good. They're pretty good for free, but like Whisper, they've got a lot of problems. But if you pay just for 1 month, $20, you might be surprised at what you can get. So, I don't get any residual from any company. So thank you very much for coming in, and thanks for giving me a chance to talk about this. And I'd love feedback if you want to email me and say, you should abandon this now.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you everybody for attending. And I'll just note that this was the last Lunch and Learn of the semester, and that the college is going to share some information on additional events. So thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully you all learned something today.
I hope you had a good lunch.